Hi, everybody, and welcome to a Vassals of Kingsgrave history podcast on the Anarchy and parallels to A Song of Ice and Fire, and probably more specifically, The Princess and the Queen. So we will be spoiling all published works by George R.R. Martin in the Song of Ice and Fire series, but not any of the spoiler chapters from Winds of Winter. And we are going to be covering the Civil War period in English history, which encompasses a lot of the 12th century, but mainly, I guess, 1120. So my name is Bina007 on the forums of a podcast of Ice and Fire, of whom we are an offshoot of an offshoot. And today I am joined by Nadia.
Hi everyone, this is Nadia.
And by Joseph.
G'day, I go by Chow Gamer on the forums.
So I was going to ask people how they wanted to do it, whether we want to go, as we did on the War of the Roses podcast, kind of through almost line by line through the period and pointing out parallels, or whether we just want to talk more generally about the Princess and the Queen and how it was inspired by the Anarchy.
Let's just start out with saying that the Princess and the Queen was definitely very heavily inspired from the Anarchy. And there are some small differences, but it's basically the same.
But who did you support in Princess and the Queen? Maybe that's a good place to start.
Well, I started off as a Rhaenyra supporter, but then Damon did his thing, and then I was and especially after reading The Rogue Prince, it's definitely, I think I'm probably more of a green now than I am a black.
But I'm definitely of the opinion they're both full of terrible people. On any given day it changes, but I'm just going to say at the moment I'd support the Greens.
I find the whole concept of people vying to be king quite selfish in a way, so both sides put me off. But I guess as a bit of a feminist, I'd have to support Rhaenyra.
It's probably the reason I supported her in the beginning. But then she was as crazy as Cersei.
She had dragons as well, which didn't help.
The dragons has got to go. I mean, seriously, they do no good, I think. I mean, that's the message you get from the real Anarchy, that in a conventional civil war with conventional weapons, it's very hard for any one side to win, and people just get tired of fighting and eventually come up with some kind of cobbled peace.
In the end, it was called the Anarchy. That's not exactly a glowing endorsement of the state of the country at the time. Was it ideal?
Although probably not by people at the time. I always think it's really weird that this period isn't called a civil war. Like, we have a civil war in England, but this one isn't. It's almost in recognition of the fact that the rebels didn't kind of establish dominance. But yeah, it always amazes me also, just looking back at all the dates of this, how long it goes on for. It always feels like The Song of Ice and Fire has compressed what would probably have realistically been like a 20-year period of anarchy into sort of 5 years or something. But I guess that speaks to the 5-year gap. So how does it translate to the Anarchy? So do you guys support Matilda or Stephen? Or neither?
Both sides have points. Both sides are full of terrible people. Any given day it changes.
But they're not terrible in the way of like raising stuff with dragons, are they? I mean...
Well, what would happen if you gave them dragons?
True. Nadia, who do you support, if anyone?
Well, Matilda, in the Anarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, Matilda. She doesn't seem nearly as awful as Rhaenyra, so I'm more comfortable supporting her. Because, well, technically she was the heir, right, after her brother, so...
Well, this is going to be a really interesting discussion about how inheritance worked in this period, because I had always assumed, she's the only... So, actually, maybe we should give the listener a bit of background. So, effectively, pre the Civil War in England, you have a kingdom that's maybe a little bit like when the Targs first invaded Westeros. So you have the Anglo-Saxon aristos who were there beforehand. Then you have William the Conqueror coming in from Normandy, so present-day France, and seizing power. And so you have a country that's very at war with itself. You've got the traditional landowners, and then you have these new Norman barons who speak French, and it's a totally different setup. So you have this very divided kingdom. And then when William the Conqueror dies, you have a situation where he has 3 sons, but one of them, the elder, is not in the country at the time. So his younger brother seizes power and imprisons the elder brother. And he becomes Henry I, which is all a bit Renly versus Stannis. And I think speaks to the fact that maybe inheritance wasn't quite as established. It wasn't necessarily the case that the elder son inherits. And also, in other kingdoms at the time, like in the Holy Roman Empire at this time, you elected the king. So the barons would get together and say, who's the strongest? So on those grounds, maybe Stephen was right to think he has as much of a right as Matilda.
Well, but it was always the king's sons, right, who were sort of... it happened with William the Conqueror when his sons were,
Yeah, but if Henry I has no sons, then, Stephen isn't a bastard or something. I mean, he is a cousin. So he's a grandson of William the Conqueror.
But again, he's like Henry's sister's son, right?
Yeah.
So again, the claim falls to a woman.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's hypocritical, you're saying, because his inheritance is via a woman?
Exactly. I mean, if Matilda can't inherit, then technically he shouldn't have been able to inherit through his mother either.
Yeah, maybe.
Just the real issue is just how non-codified all the inheritance laws were. Like, the reason that the firstborn son tended to inherit like that early in the medieval period was really just because his father left him the big army. So if someone else has an army like yours, might makes right in that sort of time period, and like you can make a fairly legitimate challenge if you have enough people with pointy sticks on your side.
Oh, I think that's kind of the point, that it's not even might makes right. It's if you have an army and if you're in the country at the time and can get yourself crowned, I mean, that means a lot. And it's worth pointing out to listeners that Stephen, I mean, he's the cousin of Matilda, but also his brother is Bishop of Winchester, which means he not only has an army, he has the power of the church behind him, and he can literally get himself crowned in Matilda's absence. So, and it also, because, I mean, Stephen's at least English in a certain sense, where Matilda at the age of 8 had been, and this is so Danny, she'd been sent off to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, and then basically hadn't come back to England since then until her father died. So she's seen with some hostility, and I wonder if this is a model for Danny when she comes back, that the ordinary small folk will be like, who is this woman? She's coming back. And in a very Danny move, Matilda was seen as really arrogant because she had been Holy Roman Empress. She'd ruled Italy in her own right. So she came back expecting fealty, and everyone's like, whoa, take it down a little bit. This is just so arrogant. So you can imagine Danny turning up with her dragons going, where are my dragons? And people being really unimpressed.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if she's actually English or whatever. She's been away too long. And Danny has never been in Westeros, technically. She was born on Dragonstone, but that's about it.
And I'm not sure how much she even knows about Westeros. I mean, in the way that Fagon has had this real education to rule and probably has been taught about the great houses, and in the way that Sansa and Arya are trained to know the sigils and the houses and their loyalties. Do we have a sense of whether Dany's been taught all that by anybody, or was she just raised to sort of get married off and be out of the way a little bit?
If anything,
she was
probably
raised
would have
by
been taught that
Viserys.
kind of thing by Viserys, yeah, who
No,
may
she
have
was
had a bit
raised
of a
by
slanted
Viserys,
view.
so I don't have very high expectations of Viserys imparting education to Dany.
But then did someone teach
Because
Viserys
he
even?
was a child. I mean, he was what, 8 years old when he left?
But that's my point. So who was teaching Viserys at the time?
He probably had a tutor or something.
And they lived in the house with the red door in Bravos, who, I forget his name, but the captain of the guard might have taught them some things.
It just seems to me like a bit of an oversight, and maybe it speaks to, if you believe all those theories about people like Illyrio not really wanting to back their claim, then the fact they've been left really uneducated and unsupported would speak to that, maybe. Because Matilda, although she was only 8, I mean, she was taught to rule, and she was taught to believe in her, Matilda Imperatrix. She believes in that. But I have to say, like the whole 1120 when the White Ship, so for listeners who don't know this period, what happens is Henry I did have a son. He only had one legitimate son. He had loads of bastards. And they were all coming back from France in 1120 in the White Ship, which was sort of like the Lamborghini of ships at the time. And the crew got utterly pissed, and all the guests were utterly pissed. And then there was a storm, and everybody died except for one butcher who survived. Henry I has so many bastard sons. He doesn't think of crowning any of them, or I find it really fascinating that, you've got Robert of Gloucester, his oldest bastard, who's a very respected military man and a big landowner. And even then, he thinks that it's better to have his legitimate daughter, who's never been in England, as his supposed heir than one of his bastards. I mean, it just seems to me that it's a lot less fluid. If you think of A Song of Ice and Fire, where Ramsay can be naturalized, or whatever the word, I don't know what's the word, legitimized.
Yeah.
Like, it never even seems to have occurred to anyone that this would be an option. Like, it surprises me in a way. So I guess my point is, did Henry I really believe that getting everyone to swear fealty to a girl would work?
No, yeah. Depends really how much, as you said, like sort of the view on bastards at the time. And I guess the very fact that he tried kind of hinted at the fact he didn't have much other choice. So he may well have not thought it would work.
Word to the wise, if you have to ask your barons to swear fealty 3 times, you probably do not think that they genuinely mean it. Oh dear. I also think it was probably quite stupid that he didn't marry Matilda to an English baron once she was widowed. Like, to marry her to Geoffrey Count of Anjou. I kind of see that because it would piss off, like, the French king. But, yeah, I just think he should have, like, cemented her claim by marrying her to the equivalent of a Martel or a Tyrrell, or someone who's actually on the English mainland.
Maybe, well, yeah, if he could have done it to one of the local Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, and maybe he was worried about sort of Norman dominance or something fading away. Oh, it's just the way that, just the patrilineal inheritance, like whoever he married Matilda to would essentially, their house, their family would end up being the royal family in England at the time, so maybe he wanted to keep like get some sort of French person in, so the family wouldn't be so. I find it hard to articulate this. Just sort of trying to keep it separate without sort of blending himself his family too thoroughly into England, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess maybe I'm seeing it from an English perspective, which is all about shoring up the English crown. But actually, for the kings of this time, they were actually probably more French than English, and maybe in his sense, in his mind, it was more about shoring up the French claim. And then, as an afterthought, if we can make the English crown certain as well, that's an added bonus. But it's interesting, actually, like, for listeners who don't know the period, there's 15 years. 1120, his son and heir dies. 1128, Matilda's married to Geoffrey of Anjou. And 1135, Henry I dies. So Henry I does have 15 years to try and shore up Matilda's claim. And I think that the tragedy is that she isn't married earlier. She doesn't have maybe an older son, so I think maybe the barons would have backed her if they'd had seen a genuine, like maybe an 8-year-old son at that point, someone they could believe in as a future king, as opposed to Stephen. But it was tricky. And I think maybe that's the problem with Dany, that when she comes to Westeros, if she ever freaking gets to Westeros, she's coming without sons, so people who would be anti her because she's foreign and a Targ and has lots of mercenaries, they might be willing to believe in her if they think, okay, well, in 5 years' time she can hand over to her 10-year-old kid, but she doesn't even have that.
No, it helps to have a local person on side, because if you're perceived as the other, like perhaps a Norman queen or a Norman king would be in Anglo-Saxon England, then it definitely helps to have a powerful local magnate to kind of pacify people and kind of show that you're kind of on their side as well.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
it's incredibly tangential, but that's how Alexander the Great, when he had a lot of trouble in Afghanistan, he essentially pacified the area quite quickly in the wake of marrying the daughter of a massive local landholder. So it just sort of shows that if you marry locally, all the locals kind of come onto your side a little bit more. You've got a strong man that they're willing to follow, even if they won't follow you.
Absolutely. And that's in fact what Henry I married, a very well-regarded and pious woman who was Anglo-Saxon, again to sort of try and unite the two branches of English court life, I guess. But I have to say, in Matilda's kind of defense, the one clever thing that she does is that when she finally stages her invasion and does so with Flemish mercenaries, she recognizes that the people of England are just so pissed off with having mercenaries rape and pillage that she disbands them almost immediately. And again, I think it's going to be really fascinating to see if Dany has the wisdom to do this. That if she comes over with her Unsullied, I mean, they're going to be so exotic to Westerosi eyes that she's going to have to very quickly assess how to use them, because they could actually do more harm than good in a way. Okay, so we get to 1135 and Henry I dies. And I guess Matilda at this point is not in England. I'm trying to remember where she was. She was probably in France somewhere. and Stephen of Blois takes over the throne, which I think is hilarious because he actually also has an elder brother. So it's a total... It's like, even if you think England should be ruled by a boy, it shouldn't necessarily be you, which I think is hilarious. So yeah, it's a totally...
Yeah, I reckon I can swing it.
It's so
I'll give it a shot,
savage.
why not?
It's so savage. And what always like makes me laugh about this period is like, you know, two of the brothers ganging up on the third. So like Theobald is just cut out because Henry Bishop of Winchester backs Stephen. It's just utterly, yeah, it's utterly savage.
Goofy if it wasn't just so terrible.
I know. And also because at this point they're cousins, right? So if Stephen and Theobald had said to all the barons, look, we know Matilda's a girl, but she's the former imperial ruler of Germany. She's got a great CV. She's married now. She's going to have kids. We are going to back her. We're going to be her military sort of backup. It would have been impregnable and England would have just had 30 years of peace. But the selfishness I find intense.
Parallels quite well to Renly and Stannis. Like, Stannis had the strong claim, and Renly was sort of the sweet talker that managed to charm the Tyrells, and you got to wonder what would happen if Renly had just immediately thrown his lot in with Stannis.
Absolutely.
Tyrells on board. Like, they would have just steamrolled everyone else.
Exactly. It would have been game over for the Lannisters, and the realm would have been in really good hands because you would have had that sort of... it's the dream team, isn't it? You would have had the integrity of Stannis, but tempered with the humanity and the charm of Renly. And the realm would have been rich at peace, and... what could have been? No books, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It would have made a very boring second novel.
Yeah, exactly. So Stephen just basically takes the crown, which is rudeness, in 1135, and Matilda's pregnant, and she's like mired in campaigns in France. And then this is the bit that always makes me laugh, that whenever shit happens in England, the Scots are always like, fuck it, let's just go and invade the north. They're distracted. So I would put to the listeners that to live in the north of England is like living in the Riverlands. It's just stupid because every time trouble kicks off, Scottish people are going to come and invade and rape and pillage, and you're just going to have armies marching through the whole time. So I would
wonder at which point they would learn. I mean, one or two failed invasions, fine, but if you're getting up near the 6th or 7th time, you've got to ask yourself that maybe a change of tack or something.
Exactly. So King David I of Scotland invades the north. So I think that's definitely a sort of Robb Stark move. Nadia!
Oh, sorry.
That's
My
okay.
internet is being temperamental again.
No problem. So we were just talking about the fact that, you know, Stephen's taken the crown, which is a very Renly move. And, like, how stupid do you have to be to carry on living in the north of England? Because every time something kicks off, it's like the Riverlands and someone else invades. It's just, it's the most unfortunate place to live.
I know. It's maybe that's where George got his inspiration. It's every time something happens in England, the Scottish invade, and then the French always land in the north, and then it's just an awful place to live.
Yeah, you probably don't want to live in Kent because that's the closest place to France, and you probably don't want to live in the Northumberland because that's the closest place to Scotland. I think everywhere else you're pretty much okay.
Very strong Ironborn vibe to me as well. How the Ironborn just have a habit, whenever there's civil strife in Westeros, they just attack something. Like
Speaking of which, so while all this is going on, the Welsh, who is basically, for people who don't know, it's kind of like the Casterly Rock end of England, decide they're going to kick off as well, and they rise in rebellion, which is hilarious. So Stephen can't defeat them. He basically abandons the territory. So I think that's kind of like an Iron Island sort of, oh yeah, everything else is going on. So if the North is going for it, why not us? So at this point, basically Stephen's king, but he's lost the North. Well, he's not lost the North, but the North is contested and the West is contested. So all he really has is the kind of like the middle of England in a way. But anyway, so he pays off the French king so they won't invade, which I think is a totally Tywin maneuver. But he has no money.
Maybe the show is right when it says that Casterly Rock is bankrupt.
Yeah, I still find that very, very... I don't understand. Anyway, that's another discussion. I find it very weird that the Lannisters are...
The rabbit hole, let's...
Exactly, it's another question. So anyway, so I think it's important that they're bankrupt because it means that Stephen can't pay his backers. You know, people support you because they think you're going to give him land and stuff. And then he has another cousin, it's Robert of Gloucester. So Robert of Gloucester is the illegitimate half-brother of Matilda, so he's like a really powerful landowner, and arguably could have become king in his own right if I guess being a bastard wasn't so bad. So he basically then decides to rebel against Stephen. So he switches from his cousin to his sister, and therefore Stephen loses Kent. So he's lost the north, the west, and now the southeast. And that, I think, is I think this is the key event. I think this is like Tywin marching to King's Landing, but backing Robert. I think it's a really pivotal point. And that allows full-on war, because now Matilda can land from France and Kent, and it's safe for her to do so. So there we go. And that's how we get to proper civil war, I guess. So here I wanted to say something like, how much do you guys know about like the religious people, like not maesters, but the high priests? Because it's a really kind of key point in this time that you need to have the backing of the church, and that very kind of aristocratic families will have, second sons who are very senior in the church. We don't really seem to have that in Song of Ice and Fire, or am I just like overlooking someone?
We're not the High Septon, but we've had instances of maesters being from some of the great families.
But the maesters, they're not the religious peeps, are they? So do maesters have power, really? Like in the way that the faith have power?
The point is that they throw it away. Like, this is the point of being a maester, is that you're a maester, not a Tyrell, not a Lannister or anything like that. But I'd say the reason there probably isn't that much aristocracy going off to join the church may be because of the whole faith militant uprising that happened not long after the Targaryen invasion, and because that was just such a bloody shitstorm and they only just won in the end. I guess there's sort of this definite sort of conscious need to keep the faith out of politics and to try to keep religion away from nobility, because if the one tries to muddle with the other, bad things happen.
But that's a huge contrast with this period. So separation of church and state is an almost very modern concept, and it's very against what's happening in this period in English history. I guess that's kind of interesting that George has chosen to take that route, and that even now.
But in Dance with Dragons, we see the High Sparrow becoming very influential. So it doesn't matter if he's not from a noble family. If he is very influential, then it will definitely matter where he decides to put his support, right?
Who is, in our time in Song of Ice and Fire, who is the High Sparrow? What kind of family does he come from? Could it be that he has loyalties?
I think he was one of the begging brothers or something and ended up as...
Okay, so it's not going to turn out that he's like the illegitimate son of a Martell and he's got a factional interest or something. Like he is just going to be a random small folk.
No, he's the High Sparrow, so by extent he was probably just some random poor guy that was dissatisfied and started just rolling around with religious people.
I also want to point out that the High Sparrow is like the most ridiculous title. It's just like not impressive. The great High Poobah. Sparrows of their nature aren't that intimidating. Like you want to be the High Eagle.
He's the very highest of the least intimidating.
So we get to the end of the 1130s and Stephen basically, he's lost his brother, he's lost his cousin, he's lost Wales, he's lost like the north, and what he does is very sensible. He just builds like shitloads of castles because he knows there's war coming, and I think it's wise. Civil War. Matilda invades England in 1140. And this is what I find really hilarious. Her husband stays at home. Like, yes. He's like, I know you have this claim to the English crown. I really can't be bothered with that. I am, going to just stay back and just, protect my borders in Anjou. And, that, like, treacherous, quizzling cousin of yours, Robert of Gloucester, or brother of yours, he can lead your army. Yeah, that's a wise move.
But he eventually took Normandy, didn't he? That helped.
Well, that helped him because it had been fighting with Anjou.
Yes, but...
You could just be pulling a Tywin, just sitting back, just, do your thing. Oh, things are turning. I should go do something now. It'd work out well for me.
I just want to point out that even if I were married to Idris Elba, if I was invading England and my husband didn't come with me and like show some willingness to get on a horse and command some troops, game over.
I don't think Matilda had that option.
Yeah, but I think that's really unimpressive. I just want to throw that out there. And I wonder if is there going to be a Danny parallel? Because who's she married to now? Some like idiotic Essos guy. Is he going to come with her with his money and peeps when she invades Westeros? Is she even going to invite him?
The interesting thing about Geoffrey and Matilda was that Geoffrey was only 13 when they started the marriage negotiations, and Matilda was, what, 25? And that sounds a lot like Tommen and Marjorie.
Ooh, yeah.
Just the age difference.
But that, you see, all the more reason why Matilda should have been able to totally boss this dude. She's getting bossed around by like a 13-year-old pimply oik. And he may have been young, but he was still fighting wars in France. So, it's not like he couldn't have fought wars in England for her.
Maybe there was some sort of a greater threat from the King of France or something. Just kind of, no, I'm just going to sit here because that guy looks kind of scary. You go do your England thing.
Yeah.
So is England worth losing his realm?
Probably not. And I think it just adds up to the point that at this period, we think of it as an English anarchy, but it really wasn't. It was equally in France, and the territories they had in France were as important to them, if not more so, than the territory of England, as much as it hurts the English to think of that. Anyway, 1140, she invades on her own, and she controls the south of England, basically because her cousin Robert of Gloucester went to her side. And you have a whole bunch of battles. I mean, I don't think we need to go through these line by line. I think people can basically go through my show notes, which are on the forum, if they want to see line by line what happens. But I think what's really hilarious here is it just seems quite incompetent. Like, they have all these battles, and in each one, like, they have the Battle of Lincoln, in which both Stephen and Robert of Gloucester are captured, which is hilarious. And then they just have these prisoner swaps, and then they reset to 0, and then they start all over again. And this basically just seems to happen for I don't know, 5 years. Nothing much happens. They just besiege different castles and end up getting captured and then swap themselves back.
Yeah, that's the reason it doesn't sound quite as bad as, Song of Ice and Fire or Princess and the Queen, is because they were mostly just besieging castles, and that was it. There wasn't too much pillaging, and there was some of it, but not to the extent that we see in the Riverlands.
Really shitty if you live near a castle. I mean, just because they're besieging a castle doesn't make them immune to needing to eat. I mean, they'll probably spend most of their time besieging things, just taking shit from people that live nearby. So if you lived in the middle of nowhere, you'd be pretty happy about it. But if you're part of some little village next to a castle, life would be unpleasant.
Which makes me wonder a little bit, what we were saying about the Riverlands or Northumberland, how mobile were the peasants? Or, I mean, any time you get any kind of grain, someone's going to requisition it and burn your shit down. This is my other favourite point about 1141. So bear in mind that Stephen was crowned by his brother, Henry, Bishop of Winchester. By this point, Stephen and Henry have had a bit of a beef over how much power the church should have. So he actually then goes and crowns Matilda.
Yes.
Treacherous little fuck. That's hilarious.
And the rest of the clergy go to visit Stephen because they don't want to take back their word. And Stephen goes oh, it's okay, I'm a prisoner, so you can take your word back.
I know. It's just so hilarious. Yeah. It's almost like Monty Python does English history. And then basically Geoffrey captures Normandy, so I think then a lot of the English aristos fine, they're probably going to win this shit, so we'll defect back. You basically end up with stalemate in 1143. It's neither side has the upper hand. Different parts of England have different courts, different currency, and it stays like that basically for 10 years, I think. Matilda just buggers off to a nunnery in France and thinks, fuck it, I'm tired. And waits for her son effectively to grow up and do his own invading.
Which he does
Carry
quite
on the
successfully.
family tradition.
Yeah, but I find it quite amazing. I mean, it's almost like you control... I mean, she hasn't won the realm, but she still rules half of it. And then to suddenly decide... Well, not suddenly, but to decide, you know what, I'm just going to retire to France and live in a convent. I find that really weird. Wouldn't you want to at least stay on the ground so that when your son does invade, that he can come in? I mean, it's not just that the small folk are tired by this point. Even the people fighting the war are tired.
That's the reason they eventually came to the truce at the end, isn't it? Because they were all just tired of fighting. That's why they agreed to accept Henry as king after Stephen.
Yeah, although in fairness, we're in 1143, the truce isn't signed for another 10 years. But yeah, I mean, I think by this point, when did Henry I die? Henry I dies in 1135, so it's now been 8 years of basically no one really knowing what the hell is going on. But I think what's really good as a sort of Song of Ice and Fire parallel is during this period, people are becoming very pissed off with Stephen because he is letting his armies run wild and using a lot of Flemish mercenaries. And I kind of think of him a little bit as maybe as Tywin Lannister, and people getting very annoyed with the antics of the Mountain and all those people. There's this great quote I want to read from the Justice Stefani, which is an account of the time, at the time of his rule. And it says, this includes Stephen actually, they took and plundered everything they came upon, set fire to houses and churches. And what was a more cruel and brutal sight, fired the crops that had been reaped and stacked all over the fields, consumed and brought to nothing everything edible they found. They raged with bestial cruelty and said, where is my chicken? Probably not. But, you know, like the bestial cruelty, I mean, that's so Mountain. And I think people who read the books, and, you know, George gets lots of criticism for how extreme some of the violence is, especially the violence against women. But my suspicion is, if you read the Justice Stefani, is that what the Mountain was getting up to is probably pretty accurate.
One character that I don't know if you've seen in A Song of Ice and Fire or not, but Stephen's wife, the other Matilda.
Everybody is called Matilda in this period.
Strong. Yeah, she seems like a pretty strong character. I mean, every time Stephen needs something, he sends his wife off to conquer like that part of the country. She seems quite capable of, you know.
She also seems quite wise. I wonder if she's like the Jenna.
Just quickly, I have like a little, I have a tab open on my browser with just has the Norman family tree just so I can keep track of all this. And yeah, no, you're definitely right. There's like 5 or 6 Matildas in about 4 generations. There's literally no other female name back then other than Matilda.
It's like when you do the War of the Roses and everyone's either called Henry, Richard, or Margaret. And and I guess again, it's like when I was reading The Princess and the Queen and then The Rogue Prince, I was like, oh my god, all the names, like they sound so similar. And come on, George. But I think it's probably fairly accurate that you have these dynastic names that you have to keep. But I always thought that Stephen's Matilda was a bit like Tywin's wife, and that, you know, she's the wife Tywin should have had survived to sort of temper some of the sternness and the ruthlessness. Okay, so I think we can move on to the awesomeness, the absolute awesomeness that is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is like my hero. So she, and I think a little bit Sansa-ish, and I love Sansa, so here are the overlaps. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, for people who don't know, you should definitely try and get a book on her, because she's just insane. She is the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, so she owns basically a very wealthy, part of Western France. And she was married at a very young age to the King of France and had lots of kids by him, but they were all daughters, so she didn't have a son. And then he basically decides to throw her over and marry someone else, so he has the marriage annulled. But before this point, I mean, she has ruled as the Queen of France, and she's ridden with him on crusades and was rumoured to have had an affair with Saladin and was just absolutely stunningly beautiful, very sexually confident, and incredibly, incredibly bright. So she's thrown over. And she becomes, therefore, one of the most high-profile and rich heiresses in France or in Europe at the time. And there's this hilarious thing of before she marries the second time of her riding across France and people trying to kidnap her and marry her for her inheritance. Which always makes me think a little bit like if Sansa was sort of in Westeros, if her marriage to Tyrion were annulled, would people be trying to kidnap her for her claim to the north? Which I guess is a little bit what Middlefinger has done right.
So look at Roose with what he's doing with a fake Arya. Like, I'm sure Roose would love to get his hands on Sansa as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, so Eleanor of Aquitaine, there's this like famous story of her riding for sanctuary in the French court, and having all these people after her. But instead, she makes this what was seen at the time as an incredibly scandalous marriage, because she marries the son of Matilda, so Henry, the guy who's going to become Henry the Second, Henry the Third, Henry the Second. Henry II. Too many bloody Henrys. And so she's 9 years her senior, and she's known to be a bit of a goer. Like, she's rumoured to be a person who has, had a few affairs. And they have this marriage, which by all accounts is incredibly successful. And there's lots of rumpy-pumpy. And what really pisses King Louis off is that immediately as she marries Henry, she's knocked up and like starts knocking out sons, like one a year. So he feels like a bit of a dick. And it's a total PR coup because, there is no way. I mean, Henry has definitely married up. If he's like a 5, she's like a 10. So but she's like the original cougar, I think, that she's married this guy who was very like robust and tall for his time, and yeah, good for her. So, and also because Henry has Anjou and Normandy and she has Aquitaine, they basically control half of France. So it's the ultimate FU marriage to Louis. And I think that as a woman who was like traded in for a younger, more fertile wife, it's like she's a hero to all of us, really. So my point is, if Dany gets to Westeros, and if she's managed to get rid of her sort of like pointless Essos husband, will people be trying to marry her and kidnap her? Well, I suppose you can't kidnap her when she's got dragons.
Would be unwise.
Yeah,
But-
I don't think Dany would be one of those.
No, but you do have Sansa running around, and I think, what are your theories? Do you think the marriage to Harry's going to happen? And if so, like, how do you think that's all going to play out?
Well, Tyrion's still
Yeah,
alive
I
and
kind of-
well, so I don't see how that is going to happen.
Well, it was well known that they didn't consummate, so annulment would be pretty easy. Like, I think that's why George had
But
Tyrion
that it would have
hold
been
back.
pretty easy before. But now that the High Sparrow is in control, I don't think he's. I don't think it's very easy to buy him off with money, like Littlefinger was planning to do. So
What's the
think so.
precedent? Like, who in A Song of Ice and Fire has had their marriage annulled?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Has anyone had their marriage annulled? I guess not. I mean, maybe how Middlefinger does it is he says, look, hedge your bets, High Sparrow. Do this thing for me, and then you know that the people of the North, and indeed the Eyrie, so like half the kingdom, is in your corner. We'll back you. We'll. That's how it always happens in the Anarchy. That they say, oh, Henry Bishop of Winchester, do this thing for me, crown me, and I'll make sure that the church lands are protected, and I'll make sure that you guys are absolutely at the forefront of domestic policy. So it's not so much that I think the High Sparrow would take money, like a cash bribe, but maybe if promised power or an equal share in power, he would do it.
But how would Littlefinger promise that? The North doesn't even believe in the Seven. They believe in the old gods.
Yeah, but he's going to have the woman who controls half of Westeros, and he can say, maybe that's what he says. If you do this thing for me, I will allow you to come to the North and forcibly convert. You can take the North finally.
So-
Again,
Sansa
Littlefinger
is a
is
seven worshipping
underestimating.
northerner.
She's like,
No, I don't think so. She's sort of switched back to the old gods, hasn't she? We've seen it again and
No,
again.
I guess ostensively she worships the Seven, but yeah, I guess she does become
Exactly, I
quite
think
pious.
Littlefinger is underestimating her.
oh, absolutely. But you can see how in Littlefinger's mind he might be thinking, what he can offer the faith is finally you can proselytize the North. I don't think the annulment's really the issue. I think it's more, do you think the marriage to Harry will, once it's known that Sansa exists and that she's going to marry Harry, will something happen to Harry? Will someone try and kidnap her? Because why have fake Arya when you can have Sansa, kind of thing?
The moment the actual marriage happens, Sweet Robin's probably done for, because he's now just in the way. But I'd say, as far as allies go, I guess the Eyrie, because with Sweet Robin gone, Harry, the heir, inherits the Eyrie, doesn't he? So, and considering they're pretty
Yep.
much the only chunk of the kingdoms, except Dawn, of course, which hasn't really gotten involved, they're pretty powerful, and just they alone, she could probably take the place over if she can get more people on her side. The discontent of the North under Roose, you never know, like, when presented an alternative, they may well just immediately throw him off.
Although, bear in mind that at this point, then the North will have had Stannis defend them against the others, so there will be another claim on their hearts, I think.
As much as I love Stannis, I just don't think he overrides Ned unless he can actually reconvince Jon to step up on his side. I think that Ned's reputation will see Sansa through over Stannis.
But Stannis has, like, saved them from, like, marauding supernatural beasties.
As
But
awesome
the
as
Ned-
Stannis is, he's also a bit of a dick, so...
But they don't know this yet.
Northerners may well just not like him. Yet.
It only manifests itself when you're up close and personal with him, or unless you see his rule,
But
which
the
we haven't
only-
really seen yet. I mean, the small folk
the
don't know
only
that
reason-
Stannis is a dick, right? At this point.
The
Yeah, and
lords
the
that
only
make the
reason
decisions.
the
True.
northern clans are siding with Stannis is because they want to save Ned's daughter, Arya. So I think if it came down to Sansa and Stannis, it's pretty obvious that they would choose Sansa.
Unless you have, what was the Sansa Stannis fanfic where they get together?
I love Stanza.
Oh yeah.
It's my favourite
Yeah.
ship. It needs to happen.
I tell you what.
Creepy as
It does.
is.
It does make a lot of sense, I have to say.
The more I think about it, the more I think it could actually happen.
We just have to get rid of Celise.
Oh, she's bonkers. I don't think that's going to be hard. But, you know, like you were saying, well, it's the lords who make all the decisions. But then, so here's my counterpoint to that. The lords may make the decisions, but ultimately it's not necessarily the small folk, but the sort of the middle classes who fight. The sort of like semi-landed or slightly richer people who actually make up the armies. And what I think is quite interesting about sort of when you get... So this has been going on now for 20 odd years. And Henry, so the young Henry, finally invades England. And he makes battle at Malmesbury. And basically, Stephen's troops just refuse to fight for him. They're just like, you know what? Fuck this shit. And they put down their arms. So effectively, Henry invades, but he doesn't really need to conquer anything because people just refuse to fight. And that kind of battle weariness isn't decided. Like, it's not that a lord has made the decision not to continue. Like, Stephen wanted to continue.
Just hypothetically then, who do you think is most likely to have an army just call it quits on them in the future of A Song of Ice and Fire?
Well, I mean, the armies of the north, insofar as they exist, I mean, they're leaderless, rudderless, and probably they've just gone home, haven't they? And isn't that, I mean, that was what we saw already, that the Stark supporters just went home to defend their homesteads. And I mean, I think it's interesting to see what happens to the people who are fighting on behalf of the Lannisters, like the smaller vassal families. Now that Tywin's dead, Tyrion's buggered off, Jaime's, you know, not going to get married and have kids. Like, you know, what is there? If you're a family, would you not switch sides? Would you not think maybe we'll back the Tyrells or someone else? Or Dany even? At least she'll restore order.
The moment Tywin, I completely destroy any hint of rebellious vassals, Lannisters out of the picture, I would consider it. I mean, with Tywin around, it would definitely, just with the whole, the reigns and the reigns of Castamere and all that, it'd probably be unwise to do it while he's around, but Cersei not so capable, so yeah.
I think Tywin dying is one of those things like when Joffrey wins Normandy. It's just, if you were just a sort of mildly in support, like ultimately, if you're a vassal and you have a small holding, like a small mini castle like the Brackens and the Blackwoods and these guys, don't you just want whoever's going to be best able to protect your lands? Like, you want whatever environment enables you to be rich. And as soon as that balance, and if the Lannisters per the TV show don't have even money, then they have no power to do that. So you'll either go with Dany or whoever else is going to protect you. Probably the Tyrells, I guess, at this point. But anyway, to wrap up the Civil War, or the Anarchy, so this also makes me laugh. So Stephen decides that, you know, if his people aren't going to fight for him, he's basically snookered. He agrees to make Henry, Matilda's son, his heir. So that's a nice compromise, because Stephen at this point is like 60 and Henry's like 20, so it just works really nicely. But, like, he has a son. Stephen has a son called Eustace, who might have plausibly thought that he was going to inherit this kingdom. And it's like, yeah, mate, so, sorry. I mean, like, how does that conversation work?
He was given a lot of land, I think.
Yeah, but, you know, a lot of land.
He
Price
wasn't
compared to the crown of England.
Eustace wasn't the one raised for being king, right? That was the elder son who died a little before Henry invaded.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, didn't Eustace go to... So Eustace goes to Louis VII in France and joins up with him, and then Henry's own brother Geoffrey also joins Louis VII. So all the younger brothers, all the brothers who want Henry, are like serially pissed off, and they like go to the French and start like kicking up. I think it's the brother William who's bought off with land. So Henry's brother William basically goes off to Wales and is given a nice castle and kind of becomes a monk and just chills out, chillaxes with the Welsh. But I really feel bad for Eustace. I think it's convenient because he does then die a year later, not in suspicious circumstances. So if Dany and like she's kind of unpopular and she's got dragons and people are wary of them and the mercenaries and whatnot, who would be the small kid she could promise would be her heir? Like, if you take the idea that she's barren and that she didn't just have a period in her little mental breakdown. Like, could you get like a Dany Tommen combo or something?
If you could pacify her, maybe Aegon would make an acceptable, like, to sort of to avoid civil war. It's like, I'll be queen, and when I pass without children, you can take over and have your claim. Although the age difference probably might make that a little difficult.
Do you think Aegon's real?
I don't know. It's debatable, but I'd say probably not, no, but he sure as hell thinks he's real, and if he shows up with a big-ass army, then most people are going to think he's real.
I suppose you could even have a situation where, like, Dany and Aegon both know he's not real, but they keep up appearances just for the sake of peace. It doesn't necessarily matter either way, I guess. I just think the age difference is not big enough between those two. Like, you'd have to have a situation probably where Dany defeats Aegon, but where somehow, yeah, maybe either a Sansa or a Rickon, or I don't know, someone has made the heir, or a kid of Sansa and Stannis. Or, yeah.
Yes. There's only like a decade between like Tommen and Dany, so I'd say if there was going to be someone with an heir, the heir probably doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. That's a good point. You know, Sansa, maybe the son of Sansa and Harry. I don't know. I always find the Anarchy kind of weird because it doesn't end with a bang. Like, I think as readers of fantasy or history, you always expect, like, the Battle of Waterloo. You want a decisive battle in which one side wins, and then it comes to an end. But it sort of just fizzles out. I'm not sure if it's the only example in English history where, like, a real period of turmoil just ends with everyone just not being bothered anymore.
Maybe just this whole state of affairs, like the Anarchy, just kind of things slipped bad and they just kind of righted themselves on their own as people stopped being all dickish.
Yeah, it always strikes me as very English, sort of a very sort of civilized way of sort of letting it. Oh yes, we'll just conveniently forget we fought each other for 20 years and sort of. Yes, of course you can be my heir, good, my dear old thing. I can't believe I besieged your mother's.
Out of our system. Get back to just kind of chilling around and importing wine from France.
Exactly. I mean, it's like the proper English Civil War. You know, not that there are any Song of Ice and Fire parallels to that, so we probably won't do a VOC on it. But it always struck me as hilarious. Like, you know, we'll kill your dad and we'll have a little republic, and then, yeah, that sucks. So why don't you just come back and rule us? But please don't kill any of us because we killed your dad. And he's like, okay, fine. It's just so bizarre.
It turns out Puritan dictatorships aren't as fun as they are on paper. So can we go back to that monarchy thing? Yeah, thanks.
Well, Puritan dictatorships aren't even fun on paper because, you know, the Puritans just aren't fun. They don't do anything fun.
Well, no, that was the joke of all the Puritan and dictatorship are not two adjectives I want in my government form, personally.
Yeah, I'd rather have, if I'm going to have shit government, I'd much rather it be sort of a decadent Catholic government.
Yeah, gotta have some fun while everything goes to hell, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if everything's going to hell and then you're going to deny me the ability to sort of drink heavily, yeah, that doesn't work. So let us recap for the listener who has borne with us through all of this. 1135, Henry I died. We are now in 1153. So we have had 20 years nearly of general mayhem. So basically a treaty is signed making Henry Stephen's heir. Eustace is pissed off, but then he, you know, conveniently dies. Everyone else is bought off. In 1154, 61-year-old Stephen dies and Henry II is king. And that's basically the end of the Anarchy. He's the first ruler to be crowned King of England rather than King of the English. Interesting aside. And also, for Song of Ice and Fire fact fans, the Palace of Westminster has been so degraded during these 20 years that basically they don't use it as a seat of power. So it's kind of like a lot of people who think that the Iron Throne won't exist. So when he kind of takes over back as king, they build a new palace south of the river in Bermondsey. So I think that's kind of a nice final Song of Ice and Fire parallel for everybody. That you will probably, whoever wins, the seat of power won't look like it looked before, and rule probably won't look like it looked before. Are you one of these people who doesn't think even that Westeros will exist, so they'll just go back to being 7 kingdoms?
I kind of hope in the back of my mind that the book ends with just an icy hellscape full of others, but the series has that reputation for being quite bleak and realistic, and I guess if all sorts of ice zombies started pouring out of the North Pole, it probably wouldn't end well.
So basically the dragons and the ice zombies lay waste to Westeros and everybody is dead. There are no winners.
And there's just some singular peasant that just survived it all, and he just lives in his little crater with the Iron Throne.
Like old Nan somewhere just telling stories to herself beside a weirwood tree. And knitting. And George R.R. is, this is the moral of the story, people. there would be outrage.
You could argue there was outrage when Ned died. He just got to keep that going.
This is true. This is true. He set the bar pretty high. So, boys and girls, we have come to the end of the Anarchy. And it's worth saying that Henry II was a good and wise ruler. He ruled for 10 years of absolute peace. And then, it's nothing to do with the Anarchy, but I just want to point out the general badassery of Eleanor of Aquitaine, because she kind of like gets her 3 sons to rise up in open rebellion against their father. So brilliant. Well, that's probably the subject of another VOK. Yeah, I mean, it's a cool period of English history. I think, to me, the key takeaway is it does just fizzle out, and I find that kind of quite civilized in a way. And I think, for me, the key point about the Anarchy is also there's a lot of lessons there for Dany, which is, if you are invading, don't use mercenaries because that's going to piss people off. Make sure you decommission castles. Make sure you're sure of the middle classes, so basically the vassal houses, because ultimately whether they choose to fight for you is going to be what wins your war or not. But I guess the dragons are the ultimate kind of get out of jail free card. So a lot of the things that you think are applicable with Song of Ice and Fire in our own time get messed up because of the dragons.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder if dragons are a bit of a literary own goal for authors, because they're so super powerful. They imbalance military powers so much. How do you even write that? It's a bit like time travel. Like, how do you make the rules of the game such that they're constrained and don't overpower the narrative because they're such a sort of overwhelming force?
There's always the argument that a lot of fantasy novels use dragons as, I guess, a metaphor is the word, or an allegory for nuclear weapons, which essentially, same deal, just this one thing that's so singularly powerful that it just kind of makes conventional forces irrelevant.
But so on those grounds, though, like the modern world parallel, I guess, is that no one uses nukes because it's mutually assured destruction. So do you ever get to a point in Song of Ice and Fire where Dany voluntarily decides to chain up her dragons and not use them for war? Like, does she learn the error of her ways? Does she see the destruction they cause in Marine, and maybe on her first invasion see the destruction they cause, and that people now hate her and think, actually, I'm gonna like have unilateral disarmament of my dragons?
Is how much of that Targaryen madness sets in, because as well as the whole icy apocalypse, I'd totally be fine if Dany just got to Westeros and just went nuts and started just destroying everything.
Is there anything else you want to say about Song of Ice and Fire and the Anarchy in particular? Any overarching themes? Last time you said advice for Dany. What are the lessons if you could teleport back in space and time and literature? And say, Dany, these are the lessons I learned from the Anarchy.
Feed the dragons, it'll make everything much easier.
Do they? Because don't they just piss everyone off? Aren't you better chaining them up and trying to win?
With the Anarchy was that, everyone had castles, and every time something happened, they would hide in their castles, and everything ended in a stalemate, right? That's why the war lasted for 20 years, because there was no conclusive end. And if there are dragons involved, then one way or another you're gonna get, a conclusion. It'll be ugly.
But it could be a conclusion where everybody's dead.
Not Dany probably. So, and anyone who's smart enough to ally with Dany might get away with it.
So Dany survives as queen of herself, because nobody else is.
No, the thing was, in Princess and the Queen, the problem was that both sides had dragons, right? So everyone got burnt. But if only one side has dragons, that's okay, because at least that side is safe.
So actually, in fact, is the theory that Dany won't even have to use her dragons in Westeros. So she comes over, and the fear of her unleashing her basically, she needs to do what Hitler did with Rotterdam, which is basically take one small city and just lay it to waste with her dragon to prove that she has them and, they are fearsome. And then say to the rest of the country, look, just shut the fuck up, go home. I'm now the ruler. I don't care who else has, gripes. We'll sort this out. And then it's almost like after Hiroshima, you make an example, but then you don't use them again because you don't have to. And everyone is just pacified and accepts the New World Order.
Exactly. That's my point.
Okay.
I think the Westerosi are just too obstinate to let that happen. It's kind of that mindset that gets nurtured when you're just essentially a feudal society full of small local people. I guess Dany would just have to have a lot of time just playing whack-a-mole with all the various minor lords that are too stubborn to give in.
Yeah, but would she use her dragons to do that, though? That's the key point. Or would she just do it with conventional military weapons?
And the thing is that the conquest wasn't that long ago, was it? And it's 300 years. The Starks knelt because they saw that it was impossible to deal with dragons. So if the Starks can kneel, then anyone can.
Yeah, good point. I guess it's recent enough that it would be in kind of familial memory in a way.
Yeah.
But then 300 years is a long time. Like sometimes I wonder, I look at people of my own age or certainly the generation younger, and you get the feeling that World War One is something very abstract to them. Like they don't get why this would be so bad. Or I think it's always amazing how quickly memories fade. Dragons in current Song of Ice and Fire are almost mystical. Like they've not been seen. They're almost like a source of fun. Like these wacky people who try and create them. I wonder how seriously people will take them.
But won't they be that much scarier?
Or are they more in the category of grumpkins and all the the way in which people view the Wall? Tyrion taking the piss out of, oh yes, these brave men of the Wall defending us against all these mythical, the boogie monster.
No, I don't think so, because the others were 8,000 years ago, and the dragons died like maybe 100 years ago.
Okay,
so
yeah.
It's not that people can have forgotten.
That's definitely true.
I mean, they actually existed, right? I mean, there are skeletons
I'm sure a
around.
massive smoking crater would jog their minds.
I'm definitely getting a picture for how Joseph would run Dany's foreign policy. If he were in charge. Just make an example. A massive smoking crater would jog people's minds. Milady.
Probably just a manifestation of my dislike for Dany, that I tend to paint her as this, marauding, murderous dragon master.
So who do you think, because we never, chatted about Song of Ice and Fire before, who do you think is going to end up on the Iron Throne, if anyone?
Sansa.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I think Sansa, right? Sansa and Stannis.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not sure what my head says. My head says that, the kingdom's probably going to split, but I don't know. I would my heart says Stannis. I want Stannis on the throne, and I would be perfectly happy if Stanza was the final victors.
Why do you want Stannis on the throne?
Because Stannis is awesome. And apart from that, he's one of, the few barely good people. There's the whole brother killing thing, which is less than ideal, but
I just think that people who like Stannis tend to conveniently skate over the fact that he killed his brother.
His brother would have killed him. I mean, I'm not for killing siblings, but if they're going to go me, I'd seriously consider beating them to it.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, one of the lessons of the Anarchy is that you don't need to kill your brother. You can just sort of pay him off with lands or send him to a nunnery or a convent.
Oh, another thing. Going back to the Princess and the Queen and the Rogue Prince. Okay, so in the Anarchy, we have Matilda and her cousin fighting it out, right? So it's debatable whether Matilda should get it or her cousin should get it and whatever. In the Princess and the Queen, it's brother against sister, right? So they both have sort of an equal claim. I don't know, cousins fighting each other and siblings fighting each other is...
It's not as bad.
Each other is so much uglier. The thing is, it's again Viserys and Henry I are similar in the way that they sort of avoided the issue. Like even Henry, he declared that Matilda was his heir, but then he refused to give her all of the castles that he had sort of promised her, which would have made her position a lot stronger.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, I think Henry definitely underplayed her hand in a way. I always think Henry's really interesting because he was trying to get his barons to swear fealty to her sort of every 5 years. He'd do another ceremony. And it was almost, my interpretation is, like he's trying to convince himself that a girl can really pull this off. And that somehow, watch what I do, not what I say. The fact that he keeps some of the key strongholds back says to me that he had severe doubts about whether this would really work. And what surprises me is that given those doubts, he didn't hedge his bets with Robert of Gloucester and say, look, you're my legitimate son, but you are powerful, you can keep the crown together, and let's go with you. It tells you a lot about what being a bastard was at this time, I guess.
I think with Matilda, the problem was he didn't want to give her husband too much power too early.
But that's always the way. Like, that's with girls. You're always whoever she marries. I mean, in a way, he lucked out with Geoffrey of Anjou because Geoffrey of Anjou actually wasn't that interested in the English lands. That he was willing to her. So
But he was very, very interested in Normandy, wasn't it? And I think at that time, most of the noblemen considered Normandy to be far more important than England.
well, it was, right? I mean, it was a lot richer.
It was a lot richer, exactly.
Yeah. So
They were Normans. They weren't English yet.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the other problem with Matilda v. Stephen. I mean, you have to remember that England is at this point very much what's the word? Not invaded. It's a country that's at war.
Satellite?
Pardon?
They're kind of a satellite of France.
Well, France itself is very nebulous. I mean, at this point, the concept of an England or a France is a very ambiguous thing. It's all about it's a set of regional baronies, effectively. So your loyalty is to your region and keeping your region safe, rather than really to, like we say, Henry II is the first guy who's crowned as King of England. I mean, at this point, there's the English, but there's not really an England. There's just regional powers. So it's kind of like Westeros right after the Seven Kingdoms are united, where no one is really that sure what it means. I mean, this has always been my theory of. I mean, I think Stanza will end up ruling whatever is left, but I do believe that a lot of these agglomeration nations, like Westeros or Great Britain or whatever you want to call it, are quite artificial, and people do, human nature is to have a sort of a smaller region. That's kind of where your loyalty is. Anything larger is kind of abstract, and I do wonder if when we finish the set of books, whether it goes back to being maybe the North, Rump, Westeros, and Dawn, and the Iron Islands.
When you look at it, it's sort of the whole, back at in medieval times, they didn't really, I guess you can't exactly call medieval to Westeros 1-to-1, but they didn't have any real concept of nationalism, and they didn't really have a concept of the nation states, of nation states. Like, polity was essentially just whatever the person in charge of it was, so they were much more fluid, I guess, about mixing, various ethnicities. Like, I'm pretty sure the Iron Islands and Dawn would be the two, real patriotic, different from the mainlanders, but the main Andal block and even the North are all pretty well integrated, and I don't see them breaking up. I think.
But is the North integrated? Because the North still has its own religion, and it's a huge landmass. I mean, it's viable on its own.
Well, yeah, it's not fully integrated, but I think they're perfectly at peace with answering to someone on the Iron Throne. Like, it's not ideal, and maybe they would want it differently. If they have to, submit to the Iron Throne, they're not that bothered about it, as opposed to someone like Dawn or someone like the Iron Islands, which were much more independent and much more rebellious.
But scratch the surface. Scratch the surface, and as soon as Rob starts marching and, shit's hitting the fan, immediately you scratch the surface and someone just says very casually, yeah, the king in the north. Like, it's almost like it's just beneath the surface of thought. Like, yeah, they're very happy to acquiesce and just, be part of Westeros. But as soon as you kind of kick the sand a little bit, those kind of sort of residual feelings of we are different do come through. Okay. Well,
also about North, it was they knelt to the dragons, didn't they? And now the dragons are gone. So why still?
Well, the dragons are back now with Dany.
The Iron Throne.
So,
but not when they declare Rob king.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah, exactly. So without the dragons are the peacemakers. They are like nuclear weapons, I guess.
Yes, exactly. You can't have a region as big as Westeros united unless you have dragons.
That sucks.
Or a thorough bureaucracy would do the trick too, but they're a couple centuries away from that, I guess.
And that, I mean, in fairness, it's probably worth pointing out that that is basically what Henry II did. So after he sort of seized off the rebellion from all of his 3 sons and his wife, the way in which he unites England and his lands in France is to create really the first concept of property law and law courts. So up until that point, justice was in the body of the king. So the king would go on a sort of a tour of England and dispense justice, but he actually created sitting courts in each region. So the property owners would feel that they always had recourse to the king's justice. He created a civil service. He created a bureaucratic machinery. And that's what united people, is that they were all equal in well, not equal, property owners obviously, but that there was more access to the king's justice, and therefore a feeling that what makes you English is that you live under the same rules, whether you're in Caen in France or whether you're in, Gloucester or whether you're in Northumberland. and that the unifying thing is the law. So that is kind of what he does. But I guess, like you say, we're not there in Westeros yet. And what I find amazing is the whole rule of Robert Baratheon. Nothing of this seems to have been done. I mean, okay, he was feckless, but not even Middlefinger or any of the small council, no one has the impetus to actually say, let's try and codify and unify a little bit more.
Yeah, you think John Aaron would have the foresight to.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's something.
They just sort of seem to have started just having tournaments, basically.
It'll be Danny who does all that.
Oh, I'm not sure Danny is a lawgiver. I think Stannis and Sansa would be the people who could do it.
Again, Stannis and Sansa.
Stannis makes so much sense on so many levels. And on that moment and note of adulation, maybe we should draw this Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast to a close. Thanks for joining, guys. It's been fun. I really like the Anarchy as a period of history, so it's been great to explore it a little bit more. So with that, it's goodbye from me being a 007. Goodbye, Nadia.
Bye, everyone.
And Joseph.
Thank you. It's been a blast.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining, guys, and have a lovely rest of the day.